jump into this presentation. So COAs for CBD, a crash course, and the main goal here is to get everyone in the audience familiar with understanding certificates of analysis, why they're important, what you should look at, and hopefully, even if you've never looked at a certificate of analysis before, you can leave this conversation knowing what to look for and what to talk about. And so briefly, I'll introduce Treehouse and myself. So my name's Jake Black. I'm a co-founder at Treehouse, and now we recently merged with Next Frontier Brands, and so I'm the Chief Scientific Officer at Next Frontier Brands. But Treehouse has really maintained all the things we're doing through the merger, and so really the focus is dual, one on research and development and one on bulk hemp ingredient manufacturing. The R&D has been a core of what we've done since 2015, pioneering new production methodologies and really hoping to study and understand minor cannabinoids and all of the cannabinoids out there. The other aspect of our business is really the bulk hemp-derived ingredient production, and we pride ourselves in novel form factors as well as consistency, quality, and compliance in everything we do. So that's a brief background about myself and Treehouse. And I'll get into what I'd like to cover today in the talk. We're first going to start off with, what is a COA? If you've never even heard the term, you'll be able to understand what a COA is. And then, as well, the slide is small, so if you want to see some of the visuals, feel free to move on up. But what is a COA and why are they important? Why do I even need to care about these things? Because many people, going to a store, buying a product, you may never have even purchased or seen a COA because usually the behind the scenes manufacturers are doing that. And then in particular, what certificates of analysis do you need for hemp-derived products, as well as, why those are important, what you should keep an eye out for, and then some frequently asked questions about different, oddities that you might see in a COA or really what to focus on. So starting from the top there, what is a COA? So COA stands for Certificate of Analysis, and it's a lab-run panel that tells you something about the product you're looking at. And this is really important for, product safety, to make sure there's no dangerous impurities or, chemicals, toxic carcinogens, things like that. And additionally, to make sure you're compliant with regulatory laws, in particular THC in this industry is a really important one, as well as it just meets if you make a product, you want to make sure you're giving the consumer what the label says you're giving the consumer. And so those are kind of the main functions of a certificate of analysis. And it's important to know that, especially in this industry, not all labs are created equal. There's probably 100 different analytical labs around the country testing for hemp and CBD marijuana products. There's only a handful that I would say are really good. And the first thing you should look for when looking at those labs is, are they ISO 17025 accredited? That's kind of the standard across the board for what a good lab needs to be doing. And so if the lab is not ISO accredited, then those COAs really don't mean much because they're not up to some specific regulatory code. And then it's important to look at the labs, audit the labs that are giving you these COAs, just as you would a supplier of these hemp-derived ingredients. And so, there's a lot of diligence that falls on either the manufacturer of products, and some of it even gets passed on to the consumer, which is not traditional in a lot of other industries, but because of the unclear regulation in this industry and lack of enforcement, it's an onus that has fallen more on the manufacturers and consumers to be educated about these sort of things. So when you're specifically searching for a CBD, hemp-derived ingredient COA, what are the important different panels you want to be looking for? Potency is a primary one, so you know how much CBD, how much THC, and how much of the other cannabinoids are present. And I'll be diving into each one of these in depth a little bit more, so I'll just run through an overview real quick. Heavy metals are pretty common across the industry. Pesticides, microbial, and mycotoxin, and so all of those have important factors when it comes to how the hemp-derived ingredients are produced, grown in the field, harvested, and then manufactured, and all the chemical processing that goes through. And so this panel of COAs really can give you some insight into the quality of a product. And so with that, we'll start jumping into kind of what these mean, and then we'll go individually through all the different types. And so when we at Treehouse purchase from a different supplier, for the first certainly 3 batches, but almost every single batch thereafter from a new supplier, we're testing, even if they give us an accredited lab, third-party COA, we're spending the money to send it out to a different lab or the same lab to get it tested ourselves. And that's because you really need to make sure the product that you receive, whether it's CBD isolate, it's a white powder, or it's an oil, you need to make sure that it matches the COAs it's given, right? A label on a bucket could match the COA, but you need to, trust but verify, we'll say. And so you should always be running your own COAs until you really, really form a relationship with that supplier, and then, implementing that into your quality system. And it's also important to, look at the COAs, not just take it as another piece of paper and file it away. You want to make sure there's no red flags, that it meets your specifications, and that you're happy with that product. And so, just because you get these, somewhat boring pieces of paper, they shouldn't just be filed away instantly. Somebody should be keeping a close eye on them. And it's important for all the things I mentioned before. You need to meet your product label requirements. You need to make sure it's safe, and you need to make sure you're regulatory compliant. So now we'll dive in a bit into each of the individual ones. Potency COAs. This is kind of the main one that everyone thinks about in this industry off the top of their head, and it's really telling you which cannabinoids are present and how much of them are present. And so CBD levels are kind of the biggest focus, and then THC levels cannot be above that 0.3% if it's a federally compliant hemp-derived product. And so those are the 2 big numbers. The main components, there's a limit of quantification and limit of detection. Don't really need to know much about those. That's just saying, at what level can they detect a certain molecule. So for example, in THC, if you see a COA, here's an example one, and this may be hard to see. You see the THC delta 9 content is not listed. It's listed as below the limit of quantification. So that's saying that they can detect THC at 0.09% by mass, and underneath that, they did not, they did not detect it. So that's where that definition is doesn't mean it's not there at all. It means it's below that set limit. And different labs have different limits, and so that's important to look for as well, because some people want very, very low levels of THC in their products, and if the lab is not testing that low, you can just see a below LOQ on the COA. But if the LOQ is 0.2 or versus an LOQ of 0.05, those are very different levels of THC, but on the report, it would say below the LOQ. So additionally, this is the COA of what, CBD isolate should look like. You see CBD here is listed as greater than 98%, and I'm going to dive a bit deeper into CBD potencies in general, and some of the questions or discrepancies that arise commonly in the industry. But so this is, over 98% CBD. There's a little bit of CBDV in this product, and then really it's nothing else. And so that's a good COA for a CBD isolate, and that's how you should be interpreting a potency COA. Another potency COA, but this is of CBD distillate, so a broad or full spectrum product. And what you'll start to notice here is a lot more cannabinoids are showing up. So there's CBC at 3%, CBD is now at 80%. You see some CBDV again. You see CBG, as well as CBL and CBN. And so this distillate would fit the kind of broad or full spectrum definition, which isn't really fully settled, but there's multiple cannabinoids there. You're getting the benefit of all of those in this distillate product. And this would, I guess, be a broad spectrum product in the sense that there is no THC there. Again, it's below the limit of quantification. So this would be a tea-free distillate is kind of the industry jargon to describe this specific product. And really those are the key parts for potency: which cannabinoids you're looking at, how much of them are there, and what is the limit of quantification, making sure you understand in particular THC levels. So moving on to a different one that's very important is heavy metals. And the question would be, why a plant that comes from the ground? Why are we even talking about heavy metals? And the answer is hemp is well known to leach materials from the soil. It's been used traditionally as a remediation crop to kind of get rid of bad things in soil to, give it new life. And so if it's planted in a field that is, loaded with heavy metals, those heavy metals will make it into the plant and can make it through the processing steps and into your final product. And so very important to look at heavy metal COAs for that reason in particular. And so arsenic, cadmium, lead, and mercury are the most common and kind of toxic heavy metals. And that's generally the battery of tests that labs will supply. Again, you have the limit of quantification. This time we have a slightly different unit as far as the measurement. So it's mgs per kilogram, which is equivalent to parts per million. And so none of these heavy metals showed up in the plant COA here. And so again, good sign and important to see all of these different COAs when you're purchasing these products. Next step, this one's pretty obvious, pesticide COAs. Why it's important, you want to make sure that the hemp plant is not being dusted with pesticides that are toxic to humans or undesirable, or there's specific state-by-state regulations. In particular, Colorado recently released new pesticide regulations for hemp-derived products. It's going into effect in July. And so now there's a clear list of what is okay and not okay as far as pesticides go in these products. And so I'll jump to this. There's hundreds and hundreds of pesticides, and different labs will do different panels depending on which state and which regulations. But this is an example of all the different possible pesticides and all of them being below the limit of quantification. So again, this is what a good pesticide COA should look like. And you have to, again, you get these stacks of paper. They're not the most riveting things, but it's important to kind of go through it with a fine grain, because if this category right here is above the limit and you just gave it a cursory glance, you might not catch that. And so it's very important to actually dive into these, make sure everything checks out, and make sure your product is safe. The next one, this microbial is important both for the kind of input hemp material, making sure the hemp that is being processed is not kind of covered in mold and fungal growth. And we'll talk about, there's also a mycotoxin, which are molecules produced by molds, but not actual molds themselves. And so mycotoxins are important as well. But for microbial COAs, it's, I would say, the most important on your final product, right? If you're purchasing a distillate or an extract or a tincture, you want to make sure there's no, bacteria, yeast, microbials growing in that will cause sickness, and that it's a clean product. And so in this case, they test kind of a battery of, E. coli and coliforms and staph aureus mold yeast. And they're looking for colonies that when they swab it would grow on a kind of petri dish. And so again, this is an example of a good COA. The measurements here are a bit interesting. The CFU stands for colony forming units, and it's a measurement of how many colonies could be grown from 1 gram of material. And so in all of these, there's no growth measured, and so that's again a good COA. With residual solvents, this is a particularly important one in the industry. And again, I'm sure these all are just blurry text to you guys, so I apologize for that. But a lot of hemp processing, if you're going to CBD isolate, it almost invariably uses solvent. You have to add a solvent to crystallize the CBD out of the distillate. Those are generally pentane, heptane, hexane, pretty nasty solvents. Those are essentially paint thinner. And so you don't want that in the product you're consuming. And additionally, extractions, ethanol is the most popular. Isopropanol is also used, but you want to make sure the end product is not loaded with these solvents that can be toxic for human consumption. And so again, this is a pretty wide panel as far as testing for these solvents. All of them are below the limit of quantification. You'll also see in this one in particular this limit, and those are set by different regulatory bodies of how much is okay. Because, it doesn't always have to be undetected or 0 or below LOQ. That's not, necessarily required, because there are safe limits, and within a practical production, you can't always get to 0 on everything. So that said, I will dive into a bit more of those regulations in a second here, but testing for a battery of different solvents in the final product, and this is a pretty much solvent-free product, so it passes all of those different checks. So those are the main ones, and we'll jump into mycotoxins again. These are molecules that are toxic to humans that are produced by fungal growth. So even if you grew hemp and it had fungus on it, and then you do all this processing, you add chemicals, you heat it, you distill it, by the time you get to the end, you've killed all the mold, you've killed all the yeast, and so that's not a concern anymore. But if these molds were there prior and they produce these toxic chemicals, they could still be in the end product. So that's what a mycotoxin is. And similar to kind of the pesticide panel, you're looking to see if any of these known toxic mycotoxins are present and at what levels. And really, on this one, it should be 0 as much as possible. You don't want any of these nasty mycotoxins going into your body. So that's an overview of the main panels that are important within the hemp CBD industry. Hopefully, again, hard to see, I'm sure, but hopefully a useful kind of way to think about understanding these COAs and what to look for. So now I'm going to dive into this kind of frequently asked questions and more, next level complexity. I won't belabor all these questions right now because they're listed on each of the slides, but a common one is you get a COA and it says there's over 100% of a specific molecule. And this is really common in the CBD isolate market. You'll see, that is theoretically impossible, right? You cannot have more than 100% of anything. And so why does this COA have 102.7%? Doesn't that make the lab look incredible and silly and ridiculous? The answer to that is it has to do with kind of a statistical analysis. And so I'm going to dive deeper into how that analysis works. But every time you measure something, there's a variance in it, an unknown, kind of a probability of it's, statistically the average is this, but it could be this or this, and that's your kind of variance in a traditional statistical method. And as you move forward and you do a bunch of these different tests, that's where that error kind of builds in, and you can actually see legitimate COAs that show 102%. And so the average, I would say, testing variance within the kind of CBD isolate testing is plus or minus 3%. So if it's 100% pure, a COA could say, 97% to 103%. We've set our limits internally at 98 to 102%. And so, from 98 to 102, that's essentially 100% pure within variance. And without a lot more time and money and testing, you're not going to be able to narrow that window much more. And so that's why you may see a number that shows above 102% or 100%. The next thing is, why do different labs sometimes provide different results? And this one I'm positive is like impossible to see, but I'll try to highlight it here. So these are the exact same product that we manufactured, sent to 4 different labs. So on the left here are the same product, identical samples sent to the lab 2 times, and these are the same samples sent to 2 separate labs. We have CBD here at 96.7% the first time, 98.14% the second time. This lab has it at 96% or 95.9%, and then this lab has it down at 80%. So this kind of gets back to what I was talking about in the last slide. Identical product, all these samples are pulled from the exact same bucket, and we got 4 different results. One is way off. And so this is why science is generally done in triplicate. Like if you get a data point, that's a one-off. And if you get the same data point 3 times, there's a kind of statistical certainty that that is a real number. So these 2 labs on the left, a 96 and a 98, or I think it's a 98 and a 97 almost. Again, within that 2%, plus or minus, those are essentially the same result. That's fine. You're going to get that variance. Same with this one over here, a 96, a little bit different, but within the ballpark of testing, it's at a different lab. This 80%, I would say, is kind of just completely false. That lab is not doing a good job. It's not, accurate by any means. And so, again, to what I said at the very beginning, important to choose labs that are reputable, you've audited them, and they're accredited, because anybody can just open up a lab and start giving you results. Whether those results are accurate is a very important notion, especially in this industry because of the lack of regulation and how nascent it is. So this is just an example side of how complex this uncertainty math can get. Certainly not going to run into all this, But again, this idea is that at every step of every measurement you make, there is an uncertainty in the air. So even if you have a ruler and you're measuring how long this desk is, at some point you're rounding, right? It could be 24 inches, but is it 24.1 or 24.2? You make your best guess, you write that down, and that's the number. But every time you measure something, and when you're doing these tests, you're measuring probably 5, 6, 7 different numbers. All of that error kind of combines to give you that uncertainty, and that's where that that's why you get those ranges and not just a distinct, this is the number. It's always going to be a range. And to get kind of more into the idea of just measurement here, if I ask you, how much does this apple weigh? That's a reasonable question. And depending on what you use to measure it, you would get different numbers. So if I put this apple on this kind of kid scale, you could get it to balance and say it's, a red block and a blue block. And that is an accurate measurement. The apple weighs 1 red block and 1 blue block. If you put it on your scale at home, it would say 0. So that apple weighs nothing. But again, that's a testament to the instrument you're using to measure. It is a real number. It weighs nothing within the scope of measurement of that device. If you put it on a kitchen scale, okay, maybe you get 100.2 grams, and that now you're kind of honing in. That's why you need to pick the right device for these measurements. If you put it on a really fancy $3,000 chemistry scale, you get 100.2159. And so all of those measurements are accurate, they're all real, but they're not essentially comparable because it's all about the device you're measuring. And that gets into this kind of deeper analytical chemistry concept of accuracy and precision. And so precision is how close you are. And so I think this is a good metaphor, this slide here, where you can be very precise in your measurement. So everything is very close. There's a tiny spread. There's not a lot of variation in the numbers, but you could just be way off, right? So if the apple, we said it weighs 100 grams, and everything you're saying says it's 50.1, 50.21, 50.9, whatever, like those are very precise numbers, but they're not accurate at all. So then there's accuracy, which is the kind of how close you are to reality, right? What it really weighs. And so ideally your methods would be accurate and precise, like this right here. So, but all of these things can creep into the measurement, and all of these things contribute to the different results you see. And so for an example, if we submitted our kind of CBD isolate to a lab for testing, all of the steps of measurement that go into it are, first, they have to measure a certain amount of that isolate using a scale. They then have to dilute it with some solvent to dissolve it to a level, and that's a measurement. Then they have to redilute it, so that's a third measurement. Then they're comparing it to a standard, which means that standard was made with some error. They then measure a certain amount of that standard. They then dilute that standard, so now we have 6 separate measurements, and then you actually run the analysis. There's error in that, like when you inject it into the instrument, there's an error in how much is injected. And so now you have 7, 8, 10 different measurements that all compound and give you that kind of variance of range. And so sorry to belabor the point, but hopefully it's a bit interesting on kind of even the philosophy of measurement, like how, anything you have, what is its true mass, and how do we measure those sort of things. So now getting into a little bit more specific questions, like on residual solvent per se, we'll go into. So you see residual solvent showing up on a COA, and you're like, oh my gosh, I can't put this into a human consumed product. I've got to throw this whole batch away. And they've, put in specific limits by different regulatory bodies that have studied how much is safe for a human to consume. And so just because you see any of these specific things does not necessarily mean it's a bad product. It just means you need to know about the regulations. And so for solvents in particular, the USP has a list of hundreds of solvents and what the kind of safe limit is for any of these different solvents. And then they scan that panel I showed at the beginning, shows a bunch of different solvents and how much is there and relative to the set regulation limit. And some customers, even though it's within a safe limit, they're like, we don't want any of that solvent in our product. That's a choice people can make. But at least, you can point to the government regulation and say it's been proven that at this level, it's safe for consumption. With heavy metals, a similar sort of thing. So now I'm showing some COAs that show some amount of heavy metals present in a product. And your question now is, oh man, like, is this now a toxic heavy metal product this is crazy. And so I'll give you kind of this little anecdote as far as FDA guidance from, I guess, back in 2006, that there's a safe level set by the government for the amount of lead in candy that is going to be eaten by small children. And so that limit should not exceed 0.1 parts per million. It's done on, how much candy will a kid consume in a day? How much heavy metals would they get if they consume 10 pieces of candy a day? And how would that impact them over their lifetime? But, there is a limit. They have studied these things. And so, you see 0.59 ppm for lead. And if that was, say, in a CBD isolate product, but people are going to be taking that and taking like 10, 30 milligrams a day, that means you can cut that number by like 100. It's back in the very safe range, even though on this COA, you're seeing some amount there. And so it isn't, unfortunately, that easy to just make these kind of, you have to do a lot of research to figure this out. And so that's kind of, again, why it's important that the labs you're buying products from or the companies you're buying your end consume product from are, will talk to you about this. They have a quality team. They've thought about all this, and they're not trying to keep any of this secret. And so that's a big red flag. If labs are like, oh, you don't need to see our COAs, or you don't need to worry about that, that's a huge red flag, because any, self-respecting lab should be really open about these COAs. We put them on our website. We're happy to discuss them with anybody. And I think that's a very important thing if you're either buying the ingredient to make your own products or actually buying products off the shelf. Additionally, I will say it would be very nice if the FDA kind of came in with some more specific regulations for our industry. Right now, all of these things I've talked about, none of them are set by the FDA, because CBD is, in their eyes, a drug, and it really shouldn't be for human food consumption anyways. And so they're not setting any limits because it violates their kind of first stance. But people are buying this and eating it and selling it all across the country, all across the world. And so to just kind of throw your hands up and say we're not going to enforce anything or give guidance, that's not great. But we hold ourselves to what their limits are for other industries, and that's kind of been our guiding thing. But it'd be nice if they enforced it so that, different manufacturers and consumers didn't even have to think about this, because they knew the FDA was cracking down on people and enforcing these laws. Unfortunately, it's just not really happening right now. Again, this is kind of just some of the math that went into that last calculation, but what was it? You'd have to eat 1.4 kilograms of CBD isolate that has this much lead in it to get kind of the toxic dose. And 1.4 kilograms is just a ridiculous amount. And that would be a daily consumption. So sure, there's lead there, but it's not harmful in any way, shape, or form. Additionally, I guess, as we're looking at like a residual solvent COA here, so you see there is heptane here, but the limit for heptane is actually 5,000 parts per million. And so 100 parts per million heptane is, 20-ish times under the limit. So this is very safe to consume. And honestly, the products on store shelves, soybean oil, different oils, they probably have more heptane or hexane than this. You just would never think about it because, again, you trust the process and you trust the FDA's enforcing all of these things. A last little interesting bit on THC in particular, as it applies to this industry, there's this concept of THC-free or tea-free distillate or tea-free extracts. And that then gets into what does free mean? What does zero mean? And my answer is there's not really a set definition at this point in time. They're working on standardizing that, but just because it's below the limit of detection or quantification does not mean it's not there. So if your limit of quantification is 0.1 and it's there at 0.09, it's going to show THC free, but if you test it a little bit lower, you would still see it. And so, we've been very careful with labeling. Everything that says THC free has a little asterisk that says is below the limit of quantification, because you don't want to get in trouble with the FDA for making label claims, which is something they are enforcing. And so just an interesting kind of, definitions and regulations would really help this industry so that, it's a good thing for everyone to understand and get down into the nitty gritty, but it's just hard to expect consumers of these products to have any knowledge of any of the things I just talked about, though it's almost necessary for them to have it right now to consume safe products. And I will wrap up here with a little bit of philosophy, some epistemology, what is knowledge, what is known. And this particularly applies to the Delta 8 conversation. I know there's a panel later this afternoon all about Delta 8. it's on a taglines here. It's the next big thing. And I really caution people for all of these COAs, they're only showing you what you're looking for. And so in this kind of construct, there's things you know, so known knowns. There's things you don't know but are known. You just go on Wikipedia and it's there. That's an unknown known. There's things you know that you do not know. Like, I don't know how far it is from here to Austin, Texas, but I know that I don't know that. But then this last category, this unknown unknowns, is really important, in particular how it applies to Delta 8, because the COAs are showing you what you're looking for. So those fall into a category of things that we know we don't know, and we're going to look for that, and that's what we're testing for. They do not test for everything by any means, and in particular, the D8 is being synthesized from CBD. It's using an acid-catalyzed reaction. That's all fine if you're doing it properly, but because there's no regulations and no labs test for impurities, you could be consuming something that has a fine COA. It shows 95% Delta 8. There's no other things on the COA. There's no heavy metals, but there could be 100 different unknown molecules that are, toxic, carcinogenic, could be benign, but you're never going to see that on a COA. You have to really dive deep in the data and look for what you're looking for. And so that kind of falls into this unknown category. And I know most consumers who put D8 in their body have no idea that they're being synthesized, much less that the labs that are testing these products aren't even looking for the impurities and the possible byproducts. And so as much as it is useful to know what you're looking for, in some cases, in particular with the synthesized cannabinoids, what you don't even know is there is super important and frankly scary to me. Honestly, I wouldn't put most of any of the Delta 8 products on the market in my body today because I do not trust that they've done this sort of diligence to look into what is unknown and not being shown on COAs. So with that, I will kind of wrap it up here. And if there's any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Thanks everyone for listening.